Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the debut album from Ian No called Between the Country. So I'm not really sure how to broach this comment in a way that it won't be misconstrued, so I'll just say it here. I've been really struggling with indie country in the past couple of months, and you wouldn't think that'd be the case. I mean, the expectation is that since indie country created the whole Nashville songwriting machine, you would find more variety or flair that's distinctive and unique. But like with other underground genres, you tend to see trends take hold in much of the same way, occasionally even mirroring the mainstream. You got the vintage rockabilly that might occasionally dabble with jazz or soul, the southern rock and outlaw country bravado, and most frustratingly for me, given how much I like it, the stripped-back, folk-leaning Americana singer-songwriter material that at its best can produce albums like Emily Scott Robinson's stunning Traveling Mercies this year, but at its worst just becomes tepid, underwhelming, and a frequent reminder that unplugged doesn't automatically translate to deep or interesting. Oh, and at some point Dave Cobb will produce something and it's basically a roll of the dice whether or not you get something striking and memorable, or you see him tip back towards undercooked grooves or a delicate vintage palette that's just become a little bit played out in the indie scene. And yes, of course there are exceptions that I will praise. The fact that Alice Wallace brought so much diversity on Into the Blue, it's one of the reasons that album has held up for me this year. But again, they're exceptions. They ain't the rule. So, okay, when I heard about Kentucky native Ian No's debut album Between the Country pick up some real critical acclaim and groundswell with the comparisons to Colter Wall and the obvious Dave Cobb production credits, alright, look, I didn't want to sound like a curmudgeon, but I was bracing myself for something good, but that I've heard dozens of times before. But hey, you know what, it was either covering this or listening to Miley Cyrus or Thomas Rhett, so alright, what do we get on Between the Country? Okay, this caught me off guard, and let me start by saying that I would not blame your average country fan, mainstream or otherwise, not being able to get into this on the first or second listen, and not just because of the sound. No, what Ian No has nailed with Between the Country is a sort of deceptively layered but jagged indie country release where you can sketch a lot of parallels, but never a direct line to other acts in the scene. And that's before you get into the content, which splits the difference between haunted, desperate, and outright brutal. Hell, I'd even call it Southern Gothic if there was even a veneer or a deeper promise of beauty, but for a record that racks up the sort of body count traipsing across eastern rural Kentucky, you get the feeling that the possibility is less likely with every single song. Oh, and for the record, it's one of the best albums of 2019, so yeah, strap in. This is something special. But first off, let's start off with the compositions, the instrumentation, and the production. And where I don't feel there needs to be a slight correction to some of the Colter Wall comparisons. Because while this album might have similar melodic structures thanks to similar roots in very traditional country, and again, we are talking about the very old stuff where you can tell that there were traces of Celtic folk coming over, which slips most starkly into the title track on this album. But from a production standpoint, Ian No is a little bit different. Yes, Dave Cobb gave them both the expansive echo around their vocals across a much larger mix, but the instrumental foundation behind Colter Wall was always a little bit more spare and acoustic to accentuate the bass in his voice. Whereas the guitar is both acoustic and electric for Ian No, they're allowed to pick up a little bit more presence, and that's before you get the piano line coming in order to flesh out some of the melody on a fair few of these songs too, or some very slight accents of simmering organ at the very back of the mix just to add some texture. Now part of this is a natural fit for Ian No's thinner, more nasal vocal tone, who seems to be trying to split the difference between 70s era Willie Nelson and a hint of Bob Dylan and how he approaches the high notes, especially on That Kind of Life. But I suspect the much narrower line they are trying to walk with this is preserving the deceptive edge cutting through many of these songs while not compromising a much richer, more textured mix, where you can actually hear the bass providing a foundation for once. Nice job, Dave Cobb. Especially on cuts like Dead in the River, where they demand that deeper atmosphere, and the guitars are allowed to get a little bit tinny or scuzzy in order to complement the seedy edge of Barbara's song or the title track, or you get the sizzle adding some real texture to Letter to Madeline, or even some of the electric guitar interplay on Junktown. Now that's not saying that the fundamental appeal of a very distinctive voice with minimal accompaniment has gone away for Ian No. You wouldn't get very spare songs like Junktown or Lovin' You otherwise, just at this time the mix doesn't lose some of the dynamics in order to get there. Hell, on even a couple songs you get female backing vocals a compliment note or some traces of field recordings of dripping water or trains. And you know what? It's a great touch in order to improve the immersion. It really works here, especially given how brittle and stripped back a lot of these mixes can seem. But honestly, the production trick I probably appreciated the most was with that slight touch on Meth head for the acoustics to sound ever so slightly jagged and strung out. It's subtle, especially given the guitar and the piano layering around that. There's a lot of acoustic guitar there, but it was just the point of texture that this album really needed to set the scene for the final two songs. But you know what? Dave Cobb's always had a knack for some of those fine details. Hell, the only points of contention I have musically toward this project is how the bass melodies could afford to be a little bit more developed. A few tunes can run a shade long, especially on the back half of the album, and maybe Dave Cobb could have eased up on the vocal reverb just a little bit. But you know what? He also knows his job for a project like this is just to get the hell out of the way and let Ian Noe deliver his stories. And he's got them in spades, drawn from hometown experiences in rural East Kentucky, where the moments of hope, they are few and far between, and the dream holding the majority of these people together, it seems like it's growing fainter with every passing day, which only increases that pit of your stomach desperation. And an important thing to note here is Ian Noe's framing is top-notch across this project. Sure, a story like the bridge collapse and the train derailment of Barbara's song and the bloody outlaw end of Letter to Madeline, they might be stylized, but they fit the barren folklore that would stand as testament amidst our modern region in decay, a backdrop that never fades and always seems to linger psychologically in the minds of all these characters. Take the opening song, Irene, Ravin, where the titular character is a drunken mess who's swaggering in late to the family home in the midst of a downward spiral, or maybe just consistently on that downward spiral, and not only is her volatility rather convincing in how her parents can't properly confront her, almost seem afraid of her, but also her own moments of vulnerability where she's just seeking oblivion and alcohol and drugs just to keep the deeper demons away. And what's more important here is the album doesn't ask you to be sympathetic for her or really for anyone here, even if their situation is desperate beyond measure, but you might feel it regardless. Take the loss of work and the instability that plagues everyone on that kind of life, where our protagonist might have a stable job on the oil rigs, but everyone else around him is falling apart. And the subtext left unmentioned is how that work is just often just as dangerous, and Ian Noe nearly suffered a accident himself when he worked on the rigs. But then you also get the opiate-racked scene of Junktown, or even the snippets of people's lives on If Today Doesn't Do Me In. It's gallows humor, it's very country, it's sardonic as all hell, but hey, they gotta have something to keep up hope. Keep on going. And you know, that sense of fool's hope, it might as well be the clearest through line and theme this project has. It explains why the otherwise kind of underwhelming Loving You sits as the unrequited yearning at the album's center, or how even moments of brutal calamity like Barbara's song or Letter to Madeline, these songs at their core, they're love songs. It's also telling when the project succumbs to nihilism, you get the darkest moments here, such as the cold-blooded murders on Dead on the River, and the slightly more justified killings that might have been done in the name of justice that found on the title track. But the question lurking behind both songs is whether in such a world where death becomes so much more certain, whether a few more moments of life might actually be the greater blessing, if only just to preserve that hope longer. Which takes us to Meth Head, bound to be the most striking and controversial cut on the album because of the mercilessly unsympathetic take on the junkies across the song, with their physical decay described in horrific but exacting detail, and damn near treated as zombies to be buried alive on the final verse. Hell, the zombie-like behavior is referenced. It doesn't even seem to match the take on the junkies and the addicts you got on Junktown. And I'll be honest, I'm a little bit torn on how to take it, because the brutality of the language doesn't really imply much in the way of nuance beyond pitiable wretches that our narrator would probably put down, embracing a drug that doesn't take away pain like opiates, but then just consumes them in a much more grisly fashion. But note that said narrator is still living in that consumed town all the same, so it could be any combination of haunted fear, disgust, pity, or even guilt that has him dig their graves early. And if you've ever confronted addicts who are fiending and violent, and downtown Toronto, I absolutely have. Look, it's far from a pleasant set of emotions to admit you might feel on a visceral level when you want to be compassionate and sympathetic, but it is a sort of pitch black mirror that Ian Noe will knock out of the park and put up for you yourself. Again, the question of how sympathetic you should be when you're trying to foster a fool's hope. But as a whole, honestly, this is the sort of full-formed powerhouse debut that absolutely justifies the hype Ian No has received. It's also a little difficult to properly contextualize and describe. The sound is remarkably detailed and well composed, traditionalist but with just enough fine details to imply more depth and complexity than the spared backdrop would normally indicate, and the tunes do cut through and do a lot of work. And the writing... Look, this album might end on a really bleak note of violence where the plea for life and hope is the most that anybody can possibly ask for, especially with the sins that might linger on your soul, and even then it probably won't be enough in the face of a grim and very unfair reality. But the fact that it persists in some form gives the project a grit that doesn't explicitly succumb to nihilism, speaking to those who are falling in between the cracks in a way that's visceral and likely more relatable than most people want to admit, confronting their emotions of sympathy in ways they aren't prepared for. In other words, one of the best country albums of the year, hell, one of the best albums of the year, one hell of a debut, and it's getting a 9 out of 10 from me. Folks, I cannot promise Ian No will explode in the same way many indie country acts adjacent to Dave Cobb have in the 2010s. He's certainly primed to, and he's got the chops to really earn it. I get on board now, folks, because this album, this guy, something special. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. I'd like to like and subscribe. I'd be more than grateful. I know this album kind of came out of nowhere, but I really wanted to get a chance to talk about it because, again, this is something special. You want to buy or stream it? Links down there below. And I got the poll up there. I am curious where you guys fall on this because, again, many of you probably haven't heard it, but you will absolutely want to. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And hey, if you want to know where Billboard Breakdown is, where it came out yesterday, it's on the new channel, links on the card right over here. But till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.